I wanted to start this lecture by acknowledging that most of what I'm going to talk about today has been undertaken in the pre-COVID world. During the last few months, I've had very few opportunities to be in prisons, but from the prison governors and other staff that I've spoken to, I've obtained a good understanding of some of the many challenges that they're currently facing and how hard many of those staff are working to try and make life bearable within the prison environment. So I think you can't have escaped some of the news that's been out there about how in some prisons, particularly during the summer, there were instances where people were not able to leave their cells for very much time at all, so often spending perhaps 23 hours or more a day locked in their cells. Many instances where education provision, for example, has been hugely curtailed, and classes have, for the most part, not been running, and many instances where prison visits have had to be cancelled altogether. What that has meant is that many establishments have introduced new technology and new ways that prisoners and families are able to stay connected. These challenges are huge, but I know from first-hand conversations that I've had how much work has been going on to try and get over some of these issues. So the things that I'll talk about today will, I think, have even more relevance and more bearing if you can keep in mind that some of the activities we're talking about simply are not possible when a prison is under lockdown restrictions. Previously, I ran 2 full modules on this particular topic and area of research, so trying to condense some of this knowledge and understanding into a sort of 40-minute lecture has been an interesting challenge in terms of my planning. What I will do is give you a bit of an overview and an introduction to some of the core topics to situate what I'll say later in the lecture, but I will also point you in the direction of some good introductory reading for those of you who this area of research and work in general is new. So what I'll cover in this lecture, I'll take you through a bit of context to provide a very general understanding of the criminal justice system in England and Wales and how that operates. I then want to say something about the role of prisons, but more importantly the role of psychology and psychologists in prisons. I'll then focus much of the lecture on sharing some of our current or very recent cutting-edge research in prisons, and much of that research is not yet out there publicly available, so some of this will be the first time that I'm talking through some of this new evidence base about what works in prisons. And where there are papers that have recently been published, I'll tell you how you can get hold of those a bit later in the lecture. And then I'll give you an indication about what's next, the things we're thinking about, the things that we're currently working on. Very briefly, here's an image of how the criminal justice system in England and Wales is structured, although some parts of the system are missing from this image, and I'll come back to that in a moment. You'll notice that I specifically refer to the criminal justice system in England and Wales, and that's because the system in England and Wales operates slightly differently and slightly separately to the system in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and the role of psychology in prisons, and in particular the research that I've been conducting and will be sharing with you today, takes place exclusively within this English and Welsh system. So everything that we'll be talking about today, the prisons that I'll be referring to, sit underneath HMPPS, Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, which sits underneath the Ministry of Justice. Some of the work that I'll be talking to you about has been funded by the Ministry of Justice, who have a lot of that oversight responsibility. HMPPS sits above the Prison Service and the National Probation Service, so has responsibility for anyone who finds themselves either in prison or in contact with the Probation Service. HMPPS has that responsibility. It has responsibility in particular for providing rehabilitation services for people when they're in custody, but also when they're in the community. And they look after both private sector and public sector prisons and services. And we'll talk through what that looks like for prisons in a moment, but it might also include community-based private services like prisoner escort services, electronic tagging, which some of you have probably heard of. National Probation Service, which is not going to form much of the content of today's lecture, but I will just talk to you very briefly about. National Probation Service look after things like pre-sentence reports. So when someone has been arrested, a pre-sentence report as part of the process that someone will go through to decide the outcome of their sentence might inform perhaps the prison that they end up in or the sentence that they receive. National Probation Service also take ownership of risk assessments for individuals, so whether an individual is classified as low risk, as medium risk or high risk. And again, that may have a bearing on what type of prison they end up in or what type of community sentence and programmes that an individual receives, and we will talk about that a little bit more in a few moments' time. And National Probation Service also manage people with community sentences and people leaving prison and going back into the community. Just briefly on risk assessments, which we will come back to, these risk assessments that are undertaken by the National Probation Service, even when someone goes into prison, that risk assessment will follow them and move with them, excuse me, and be updated as part of their sentence planning and progression. Young people, and I'll just say a brief note about this because this is not the focus of today's lecture, but young people who find themselves in contact with the criminal justice system, particularly those under 18, are dealt with completely separately and outside of this particular element of the system, typically through youth offending teams, also through youth courts, so a separate system. Much of the work that myself and colleagues do through the Institute for Community Research and Development focuses on youth offending teams, young people in contact with the criminal justice system in the community. And if any of you are interested in finding out more about that, feel free to email me or have a look at some of the content that we've got freely available on our website, where you can find out more about current work going on in those sorts of settings. So on to the focus of today's lecture. I want to say a huge thank you to Clinks for the map that you see on screen in front of you at the minute. Clinks is a really, really useful organisation for those of you who are interested in learning more about prisons and the criminal justice system, the way that operates, particularly voluntary sector organisations that work in and around the criminal justice system. I hugely encourage you to access the Clinks website and have a look at all of the resources that they have available there, including a slightly easier to view version of this particular map. So this map has on it the prisons that exist in England and Wales. At last count, I saw 123 prisons, most of which are run by HM Prison Service. That number does change because prisons sometimes are closed, new ones are opened, and some prisons are repurposed, but we're broadly talking about that sort of number. 10 of those prisons house adult women, and those of you who are interested in issues around women and criminal justice, as I am, will I think want to note that 10 prisons means that those prisons are quite geographically diverse. They're the ones that are marked in purple on this particular map. That that geographic spread means that families, anyone who wants to visit a woman in prison, often has to travel a significant distance, very, very regularly, over 50 miles, often much, much more than that. So in terms of things like maintaining family ties, that makes that particularly challenging, partly around geography, but also for a number of other issues that I won't go into today. So around about 10 adult women's prisons, many of which I've worked in. About 8 prisons are high secure prisons, so what we call category A prisons, for those prisoners who are deemed to be particularly high risk. Have a number of YOIs, young offender institutions, for young people who find themselves in prison. And of the rest of the general prison estate, we've got a number of category B prisons, category C prisons, which are training establishments, and category D prisons, which are typically open prisons or resettlement prisons, so preparing people to leave prison and go back into the community. Category B prisons also often function as remand prisons, so for those people who are awaiting their court date or awaiting sentence or trial, some of those individuals will be put into prison and held on remand. And I think it is worth stating, although it's not the core content of today's lecture, worth noting that at the minute, partly to do with the COVID situation, but also partly to do with huge delays generally in the criminal justice system and processing of cases, there are more and more situations coming to light of people who've been held in remand prisons for a very long time, and in fact when they do eventually go to court and receive their sentence, are then released immediately from prison because in fact they have already served over the sentence that they might have been given. And I think this situation looks set to worsen in the coming months and years, so I'm not going to discuss that at length today, but I just wanted to highlight that and leave that one with you before we start to look at some of the research as part of the lecture today. HMPPS state that we will provide safe and supportive environments where people work through the reasons that cause them to offend and prepare for a more positive future. They also state that we reduce reoffending by rehabilitating the people in our care through education and employment. So what we should note here is that the focus is not on punishment and retribution, but on rehabilitation. Now, in very practical terms, there are quite significant questions I could raise about how far that is being actioned and achieved, but this purpose, these statements really situate what we're talking about today, particularly in terms of psychology's role within that. So fundamental to the basis of my work and to psychology in prisons more generally is that punishment is ineffective, but rehabilitation, so giving people the skills and the desire to lead positive lives, is the only way to successfully reduce risk of reoffending. And working in that way through rehabilitation is better for those individuals, it's better for their families, and it's better for society as a whole. And when we think about the psychology of prisoner rehabilitation, I think it's important to state that actually for the most part we're not talking about those very high profile types of crimes and offences, that kind of glamorous stuff that sometimes makes the news headlines, but we're really talking about the day-to-day needs of the majority of people who find themselves in contact with the criminal justice system, and that is the really important stuff. Those slightly mundane sounding offences sometimes, the needs that every individual presents with, and how we can work to reduce those needs, reduce reoffending, reduce the impact of crime on society. A focus on rehabilitation is core to an effective justice system and to the purpose of prisons in England and Wales. The role of psychology, and forensic psychologists in particular, is absolutely central to that. So forensic psychologists apply their skills across assessment, so assessing the needs and also the risk that people in contact with the system might pose, particularly thinking about treatment, research, and other roles that are allied to some of this. And that happens right across the justice system, but psychologists, forensic psychologists, are embedded within most prisons in England and Wales. Now, apart from the assessment of needs and of risk, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a few moments' time, psychologists have an absolutely central and core role in helping prisons to continue to develop the programmes that they offer to rehabilitate people. And if we think about the development and implementation of a new programme in prison, it's really important to make sure that any new programme is not only likely to be successful in rehabilitating people and therefore hopefully reducing people's risk of reoffending, but also to check that inadvertently that programme doesn't in fact cause any harm or increase people's needs or increase any of the risks that are posed. So psychologists' role there is in bringing an appropriate theory base to any new programme. So what does the theory, what does the existing evidence tell us about what is likely to be successful in working with prisoners? And then also to embed through the delivery of that programme, collecting research and evaluation on evidence of effectiveness so that we can continue to evaluate and monitor programmes, gather evidence about how successful they are. And it's that area of work that much of the work that myself and colleagues do, that's where that fits into the prison system, and thinking about how we continue to develop programmes and work better with individuals and with prisons. When we're analysing or seeking to understand criminal behaviour, the concepts of risk and need are really useful to help us think about, but help us distinguish factors that affect how likely it is that someone will commit crime. So we talk about those as the needs, so understanding the needs that someone have that might be related to the crimes, the offences that they commit. And we understand that the needs that someone has therefore have an influence on the risk that that person poses in terms of how likely they are to commit offences or to reoffend. A couple of researchers called Andrews and Bonter back in the 1990s developed a concept of what we call criminogenic needs, so the list that you see on screen. And they talked about how these are the particular needs that are associated with risk of offending or risk of reoffending. And so essentially they were a group of needs that might be responsible for crime. They suggested that an individual factor about a person or a situational circumstance that a person might find themselves in, that when altered or changed might affect the chance of reoffending, could be defined as a criminogenic need. And those needs, those factors that we see on screen there, can be classified as static, so things like someone's educational history, how well did they perform at school, did they get any qualifications, were they kicked out of school, for instance, or their criminal history, have they got a long history of crime or have they got no history of crime. Those factors can be seen as static, so they don't change, they're in someone's past. And then Andrews and Bonter also talked about dynamic factors, so the things that we can influence, the things that we can change. So they might be things like employment status, or someone's skills, likelihood of gaining employment, or individual patterns of behaviour or thinking patterns. And as psychologists and as people working in prisons, those changeable factors are the ones that we're really interested in. Now, these things, these factors, these criminogenic needs are likely to vary over a person's life, and it's likely that the factors that are involved in the development or someone starting to get involved in crime and commit offences might be different from the things that perhaps support or maintain some of those behaviours. So if we're conducting a risk assessment, seeking to understand someone's particular needs that are related to their criminal behaviours, these are the things that we measure, these criminogenic needs. So the things that you see on screen are the core areas that we measure in the types of general risk assessments used in prisons in England and Wales in particular, but these underpin the general risk assessments used in many countries around the world. And we're interested in understanding which of these areas are particularly important for the individuals we work with, and then how we can address those through programmes, through training, through skills development, through support, to try and reduce some of that overall risk pattern. I should also note that outside of psychology, outside of forensic psychology in particular, some of this focus is a little bit contentious, and what I'm saying here is that I really encourage you to go and read about some of this. I'm not going to embark on or talk about that debate today, but I encourage you to read about it and to get in touch if you want me to send you any useful links to things that I'm not covering today. Here I wanted to present you with a case study, so a worked example of how these identification of these needs and understanding risk might play out in real practice in prisons. So this case study example is taken from my forensic psychology book, published with my colleague Dean Wilkinson back in 2014. And I should note that while this is an anonymous example, this case study is made up of the stories, the experiences of women that I have worked with in prisons. So Sabrina was arrested for importation of a Class B drug. Risk assessment was undertaken in prison and demonstrated that she had significant needs in the areas of education and employment and financial problems, so some of those criminogenic needs that we saw on the previous page. So Sabrina had issues previously in that she'd been expelled from school, didn't really have any particularly stable history of employment, and in adult life had got herself into serious debt, so had significant financial problems. Given the type of offence and that she was scored as relatively low risk through that risk assessment, she was given a 3-year custodial sentence but in open prison conditions. Her sentence plan, so each prisoner should be given a plan for their sentence, which is really an action plan that maps onto the areas of need that have been identified for that particular individual, and a plan to help address some of those needs that come out in that assessment. So through this sentence plan, she was given things that she had to engage with, including a financial awareness course, so addressing some of those financial issues, and gaining some volunteer work experience, so developing those skills, developing that experience to try and tackle some of the issues in that particular area. Towards the end of her sentence, Sabrina was put in contact with a charity that helps provide work or find work for people who have got convictions, because we know that can be a barrier and a challenge. And the aim here was that on leaving prison, Sabrina would have addressed some of those things that were problematic for her, some of those needs, so that she could leave prison, find work, manage her money better, and that would help prevent her from committing any further offences. A range of programmes exist right across the prison and probation services aimed at directly challenging the needs, the criminogenic needs that we talked about a couple of slides ago. These programmes might be what we call offending behaviour programmes, which are accredited programmes developed from a significant theory and evidence base that we know challenge those needs. And the role of us as psychologists is both to deliver those programmes, but also to keep conducting research to understand the effectiveness of those programmes as they're delivered, but also as they might be rolled out with different groups. So those programmes might be addressing the mental health and wellbeing issues that people have. They might be looking at reducing people's needs around alcohol and drug use, for example. They might be focused on education. They might be focused on financial issues. And we continue to refine these programmes and to think about what is most appropriate with different groups in criminal justice. So with adult men, adult women, people who've conducted particular types of crime, how can we adapt those programmes to work with young people, for example? And we also keep thinking about new and innovative programmes that can be implemented both across the prison estate but also with some of those particular groups. So I'm about to talk you through two examples of really current work that I've been involved with that have been delivered with the prison service and the Ministry of Justice, and we've been conducting research on them to understand their contribution, their effectiveness, but also how they can be developed to do more and do better. I've recently been working on a highly innovative project funded by the Ministry of Justice in collaboration with the Design Against Crime Research Centre at St Martin's, which is part of the University of the Arts London. And if as a psychologist I'm interested in rehabilitation, this project has been really exciting because it goes broader than thinking about individual programmes within prison, but seeks to address some of the basic living conditions within prisons and the impact of those on the general and the basic needs of prisoners. Some stark facts for you. A recent report published by HMPPS, NHS England and Public Health England provided data showing that during the last 5 years, so 2014 to 2019, self-inflicted deaths and self-harm had risen significantly, suggesting that mental health and well-being has declined significantly. The current evidence shows that mental health as a whole in prisons in England and Wales has been significantly declining due to factors including poor living conditions, so unsanitary cells for instance, lack of stimuli, so a lack of purposeful activities in prisons, and long periods of isolation. And if we know that the data tells us that that has been the case over the last 5 years, I think we can only imagine the impact of some of this during this period of the pandemic. Data from HMPPS in 2019 also tells us that there are significant issues with safety in our prisons. So safety outcomes had declined in 10 prisons that were inspected, but had shown improvement in some prisons. Violence had increased in more than half of the prisons that were inspected. The use of peer support and collaborative approaches to addressing violence were features of the safety prisons, and I'd like you to remember that point when we move on to the next slide in a couple of moments. A combination of poor living conditions and a lack of purposeful regime contributed to continued drug use and violence, and the number of self-inflicted deaths and incidents of self-harm had increased substantially last year. the issues that we looked at on that last slide really focused around mental health, self-inflicted deaths, violence and safety in prisons, and some of the factors that the data shows are perhaps responsible for increases in some of that, and some of the things that perhaps could be addressed to reduce some of those sorts of issues. And when we're talking about this, I really want us to remember that for each one of those pieces of data, each one of those issues that we're talking about, we're talking about real people and real people's lives and experiences, but also real people with families and connections who are affected by some of these issues. And we're also talking about staff in prisons and the impact on staff of working in unsafe conditions, or of working with people with high levels of need, particularly with mental health and well-being needs, can really take its toll. So there's a ripple effect. There are a lot of people who are affected by many of these issues. And if you think back to what we were talking about earlier with criminogenic needs, you can see that these issues have particular significance in that way too. So we see that cell spaces affect well-being, that furniture in prisons is regularly broken and used for self-harm and violence. HMPS has tried to address some of those issues with cell furniture and cell spaces in the past, and decided to embark on this particular project, the Cell Furniture Project, to try a new and innovative approach. And my understanding is, our understanding is, that this type of approach has never been tried before anywhere in the world. So the 18-month Cell Furniture Project started on the 1st of September 2018 and has very recently concluded. It was designed partly to tackle some of the issues that I've just been speaking about. We knew it wasn't going to fix the prison system and the issues with that, those really fundamental issues, but through working with prisoners, with prison staff, with former prisoners, experts and specialists from prison industries, designers, design researchers, students and social scientists, the aim was that we could maybe start to address some of those issues. You can see on screen a diagram of the design process that the team from the Design Against Crime Research Centre undertook. And the project brought all of the groups together that I've just mentioned, ensuring that the expertise of, say, the designers was valued equally to the expertise of the prisoners who are used to living in cell spaces, who are used to living with the furniture, perhaps have first-hand experience of how that furniture can be used, misused, abused. So there were a few stages to this particular project. There was a research and information gathering stage, so learning from all of those different parties, both going into prison, bringing staff, prisoners and designers together in collaborative spaces to do some of that learning, followed by a design process, so an iterative design process involving those different groups, coming up with initial designs, refining those designs, talking to the prisons and prison staff about where those designs perhaps might be useful and sensible, but where they might also have concerns, say, about safety or sustainability, to come up with revised versions of those designs. And the process ultimately produced a range of product outputs, recommendations for new products, and also design resources and a digital research archive. We conducted research on the impact of taking part on this collaborative design approach, so the impact on prisoners and prison staff. In reality, what that meant is that we went into the prisons where the work was being undertaken to observe some of those processes. So how did it work? What was the impact on the different groups of working collaboratively in this way that is so unusual in prisons? Having prison staff, senior prison staff sometimes, and prisoners together, attempting to work with them on an equal footing is highly unusual and really goes against some of the way that prisons are fundamentally set up. So we went in to observe that process and look at the impact that that had. We provided evidence about some of the successes and the challenges that became apparent in embarking on such an approach within the prison system, and we're able to relay some of those findings back to everyone involved in the research and the Ministry of Justice as the body funding some of this. And the evidence that we presented suggested that implementing this new model of collaborative, design-led thinking work in prisons was really successful in achieving prisoner engagement, and that it also had a direct contribution to coming up with successful designs for prison furniture that aimed at reducing violence and self-harm among prisoners. So in terms of that process, that collaborative process, listening to the voice of prisoners, listening to the voice of prison staff, there was a clear benefit there in terms of people's experiences and the value of that collaborative working on people's feelings of self-worth, of value and well-being. But one of the core aims of the project was also to think about the impact actually on furniture that exists in cells and how their cells are designed on some of the issues that we looked at a couple of slides ago, so around mental health and well-being, around self-harm, violence, those types of issues. So through the research and a thorough review of the evidence, we've made proposals about how to capture the impact on well-being, on relationships, on self-harm, on violence, and also on the sustainability of the furniture in the future. So how sustainable is it in ecological terms, but also in terms of how likely is the furniture to be broken or not broken, hopefully. From a number of design proposals that came forward from the team, some have been taken forward. So this is a proposal for a multi-purpose chair to go into prison cells, a proposal for a metal bed, and for some cardboard furniture. These have been selected by HMPPS for prototyping, and we hope to keep working with the prisons and the Ministry of Justice to evaluate the impact of the new furniture on those issues of well-being and safety. While the previous project I considered looked at general issues around in-prison experience that are likely to affect everyone right across the country who finds themselves in prison, this next project that I want to talk to you about focuses specifically on the needs of women in prison through a project called Making for Change. So this is at a women's prison which is HMP Downview in the south of England, and it involved the setup of a fashion training and manufacturing unit, which was a partnership between HM Prison Service and London College of Fashion. The project involved the creation of a fashion manufacturing unit within the prison, and you can see some of the images on screen there of the actual unit as it exists today in that prison. Now, as a psychologist, I had no experience of such a unit out in the world anywhere, let alone in a prison. So just after the unit had been set up, I took a colleague along with me who's got experience working in design and in similar sorts of units, and this colleague said this was as good as any unit that she'd visited anywhere on the outside, and in fact we both commented on how being within that unit really didn't feel like being in a prison. Training in fashion production skills is a core part of the work of the Making for Change programme, and participants receive accreditation with industry recognised skills and qualifications. It offers them a route, or the aim is that it offers them a route away from offending and re-offending, while also seeking to address a skills shortage within the UK fashion manufacturing industry. So if you think back to those criminogenic needs that we talked about, this project really focuses in on skills, on training, and on preparing people for employment. On a day-to-day basis, what this project involves is a group of women, a team of women who go in every day and work within the Making for Change unit over a number of months, and this is essentially the job that they undertake. So they're gaining skills, they're gaining qualifications, and it's preparing them for work. And I last week spoke to some of the delivery team who work on this project, and they were able to confirm that the project had continued operating throughout the COVID period because they were able to bring the women in as a bubble of women going into the unit to work together every day. So that was particularly good news for me to hear. A number of women have now gone through the programme. They've achieved their qualifications, which are the equivalent to qualifications that they could achieve through college on the outside. So in fact, an external college provider comes into the prison to assess the qualifications for the women. The unit has also received numerous commissions, some from quite high profile designers and design houses, to make and manufacture some of their particular products. So in many ways there's lots of evidence of success in this way of working within this particular women's prison. But as researchers, we had a number of other questions that we wanted to ask to really understand whether the programme does in fact meet its aims and objectives, but as a psychologist also to understand the impact on women's rehabilitation and likelihood of being rehabilitated and staying away from crime in the future. So the research that we undertook in the prison and with the team looked at the impact on women's well-being, on women's learning, and we also made some recommendations about how the programme could continue to be developed. The women experienced self-reported improvements in their mental health and well-being, and we think that was largely down to that experience of working in a collaborative environment with supportive tutors and employers, also having that focus and really feeling that their day-to-day work and development was valued and valuable. The women taking part in Making for Change reported that they felt really inspired and empowered for the future, which is very positive, and at a surface level I think sounds like a particularly positive finding. But we also needed to highlight some needs that would develop out of people feeling inspired and empowered. Essentially, when people's aspirations are raised, where we raise those aspirations, we also have to think about what opportunities we can provide for those aspirations to be met. So our recommendations were for the Making for Change team, in continuing to develop the programme, to really focus on what opportunities they could provide for the women. So really positive outcomes in terms of women's progress through the programme and what they experience there, but needing to make sure that when either the women left the unit, or more importantly when they left prison, that there were opportunities for them. So that resulted in this model that you see on screen. So the training that's delivered through the Making for Change programme, through the manufacturing unit, also giving the women work experience within the Making for Change unit so that they're really prepared for work on the outside. Then through prison ROTL, which stands for Release on Temporary Licence, allowing the women to get some work experience on day release from prison. And then when the women leave prison, providing them with employment upon release. And it's this last part that we've been following up with the Making for Change team in the last few weeks. So essentially the team has done what they proposed they would do in this model that we developed with them about 18 months ago. And they focused significant energy on setting up a Making for Change community manufacturing space at Poplar Works in London. If you want to find out more about Making for Change at Poplar Works, there's plenty out there on the internet about the recent launch of that particular initiative. So I'm currently embarking on a piece of work with the Making for Change team and a filmmaker to capture the stories and experiences of women as they leave Making for Change at HMP Downview and move into the community and engage with Making for Change at Poplar Works. So continuing their work with them, continuing employment. For those women who do engage, this directly addresses some of their needs and is likely to significantly reduce their risk of becoming involved with crime again in the future. What next for my work in this area is that we're continuing to work with the projects that I've talked about today, but we've also recently embarked on a new programme of work specifically focused around older prisoners. This is the fastest growing group of prisoners right across the world. I've just published a systematic review paper with a colleague in the Journal of Criminal Psychology. If you haven't got access to that journal and would like a copy, send me an email and I'll happily send you that paper. There are significant questions about how to work with this particular group who historically have not been a very significant part of the prison population, and they pose many issues in terms of the significant needs that they have, often health and mental health related needs. I've got a PhD student, Ashley Whitwell, who has recently joined us to undertake part of this programme of work in collaboration with HMP Stafford, which houses a very large number of older prisoners. And over the next couple of years we'll all be working together collaboratively to understand those needs, how best to work with this group, and hopefully provide some models of best practice that can be rolled out more broadly across the prison estate. I mentioned right at the beginning of this lecture that I'd point you in the direction of some further reading that can give you an introduction to some of the basics of topics around forensic psychology and psychology in prison. So it would also be unusual of me to give a lecture where I don't do a plug for some of my own books. So I would like to point you to Forensic Psychology, a textbook as part of the Psychology Express series, written by myself and my colleague Dean Wilkinson. If you haven't got access to the book through a university library, where there are ebook versions, I believe that you can currently purchase an ebook version online for about £6.50. That book takes you through general principles in forensic psychology and topics that are very closely related to the sorts of things I've been talking about today. If you're interested in research in criminology and forensic psychology, research broadly in the criminal justice system, my research methods book, Criminological Skills and Research for Beginners, written with Jane Hill, currently I believe has 20% off on the Routledge website, but again you might be able to get access to the book if you're part of a university and have access that way. With both of those books, free to access companion websites exist. If you, for the forensic psychology book, go through the Pearson website, you can access the companion website. If you go through Routledge, you can access the companion website for the research methods textbook. Both of those websites have a wealth of resources that are freely available to anyone to get access to. Some of the papers that I talked about today, if you're unable to get access to those, and perhaps you don't have access to that particular journal, feel free to send me an email and I'd be very happy to send you copies of some of the papers that are available. But as I said through the lecture, some of this work is either currently under review or sitting with the Ministry of Justice waiting for us to be able to publish some of that.